One of the biggest concerns I have as a financial advisor is just making sure that people understand some of the ways that they can build wealth, but more importantly, some of the ways that they can protect the wealth that they're building as well. Like, what point is it in taking risk with your hard earned money and making a really clever selection in terms of what to invest in if you haven't actually covered your backside in the process? Like, why would you bet the family home on something which is only maybe going to succeed? So when I hear about things like central bank issued digital currencies, understandably, I'm scratching my head a little bit. Why aren't people talking about this way more than they already are? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they otherwise? Personally, so far, I think they're probably a bit of both, but it's important for you as an everyday person to understand how it will potentially affect you. So today I'm catching up with Jodie Bruning. She is from PSGRNZ. She is somebody who has done the research, though, and I'll insert a link into the notes for you to read yourself so that you can see the backstory of what has been going on in terms of the rollout of a central bank issued digital currency here in New Zealand. So, for those of you who are just kind of waking up to this term, CBDC, what is it? Just think about the money in your bank account getting smarter. That's basically what it is. And having a direct line of communication to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand or the central bank of whatever country that you're dialing in from. So imagine you go out there and you own a property, you then sell that property in about 30 years' time, and you've made a $500,000 profit. Fantastic. Now, what are you going to spend it on? Well, right now, you can make whatever decision you want, and there's no restrictions to a certain extent as to what you can buy. In the future, with programmable money, which is what CBDCs really are, programmed by the state or by a central bank, they will be able to tell you and dictate to you where that money goes. Or at the very least, they will have the ability to do that. Regardless of whether they will use that or not is another matter. If we're investing for intergenerational wealth, especially, we need to understand the convertibility of our assets back into liquidity and all of the risks that we're taking, not just while it is being invested, but afterwards when it's converted back into a form of money that we can trade for goods and services. Now, if you're new to this podcast, my name is Darcy Ungaro. I'm a financial advisor, and I talk about all sorts of things that can help people build new types of wealth for the new world that we're heading into. Please give us a thumbs up, subscribe so that you can hear more. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on central bank issued digital currencies. Are they good? Are they bad? Or are they something completely different? Let's get started.
いただきます。
All right, welcome everybody to the Everyday Investor podcast. Today I'm in the blessed company of a sociologist in the form of Jodie Bruning. How are you, Jodie?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you for inviting me on, Darcy.
No worries. Recently, we saw the Central Bank of New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, put out a little bit more work in the area, stage 2, in terms of their rollout with a potential CBDC. And they referred to it as digital cash. And I wanted to know from your perspective, considering right now when we log into our bank accounts, it kind of looks like digital cash right now, or digital money at least. Is a CBDC, is that fair to call that digital cash?
No, it's entirely unfair, absolutely and utterly unfair, because that's what we have in our bank accounts right now. And it's what the government produces when it appropriates in the budget money to pay public sector employees and to undertake infrastructure projects. So we're paid in digital cash every single day. So the key difference here is that digital cash isn't able to be programmed. And there's another issue here, that it's not composability, so you can't bundle the programming together. So this tracks back to a lot of the issues that we see that are problematic. And of course, there's an 80-page paper that I've written that is on PSGR and Z that underpins what I'm saying today. So it's not me just inventing this. It's quite a bit of research behind that.
Yeah, I'll include that in the notes as well. So when we think about this, like, one of the biggest questions I have in my head rolling around is it inevitable? Is it inevitable that we are going to see CBDCs? Because we have, as of this year, I think 134 countries exploring CBDCs, 98, representing 98% of global GDP. 64, 66 countries are now in the advanced phases. 93% of central banks are either engaged in research or development around CBDC. So it kind of feels like, hey, this is happening. What's your view, though? Is it inevitable that we will be using CBDCs in the future?
It shouldn't be, simply because, and so the concern for me, and this is, so when I look at a pesticide formulation, I look at the mixture, and is the toxicity of that mixture, for example, being assessed by the regulator that says it's fine for a farmer, for example, or applicator to have that substance on them weekly. The formulation is where the magic is. That's the toxicity, and that's what's patented. When you look at a CBDC, you will need to have your digital ID in order to associate, to bring those two together. You cannot have a CBDC in isolation. So this is tying back to your ID and who you are. So this is overseen in New Zealand, for example, by the DIA, and so the DIA has extraordinary power and extraordinary powers of observation over what we do and how we'll do it. And of course, they'll say, no, this is fine. But we already know there's a bunch of information sharing agreements across government. So then you connect your digital ID to CBDCs. All of a sudden, from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand through to the DIA and all the partner agencies, if they want to access information, they can. But the bigger concern is this massive differentiation from digital cash, which is the composability, the fact that smart contracts can occur, and that the smart contract can come from a third party, so they don't even need to be direct. And there can be a lot of smart contracts sort of doing all this work. Mm-hmm. So we need to be extraordinarily skeptical. Now, the other reason I say it's not an inevitability is we need to, if you look at the tracker, the Atlantic Council CBDC tracker, it's funded by I believe, if I remember correctly, the Boston Consulting Group. So what we're seeing, and this is why this 80-page document had to be so long, is that governments are being led by the nose, by this management consultancy firms that are working and consulting with big tech. So we've seen the World Bank lead policy, and they're very proud of it, on digital IDs. And then they've led policy, they've engaged in the forums with the World Economic Forum, who have their 100 lead stakeholders that, again, are all the management consultancies, the top organisations and government officials. So we see the World Bank liaising over a long period of time with these management consultants. So Accenture has taken a large role in developing digital ID, and I talk about this in our paper. Then we have the Bank of International Settlements, which has taken a lead role in the development of the CBDCs. Mm-hmm. So you can see, and Augustin Carstens, who is the head of the BIS, has written manifold papers on this. He's taken a lead role. He's very focused on the Finternet, which is imagining where all this is going and how it will operate. And so Carstens, so Bo Lee of the IMF, I think, the quotes that are coming directly out of their mouths are saying this is what's going to happen, this is what we're going to do. But remember, this is not democratic states leading this. They are being led. The evidence very comprehensively in New Zealand shows that Accenture has taken a lead role in developing the RBNZ, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's policy around this.
Okay. So going back to just something else that you've touched on this word a couple of times, composability. Can you just clarify what that phrase means in this context?
So composability is the bundling of smart contracts. Okay. So pulling them together. And there's a really good image that I've put on in our paper, but you've got the potential. And so, Augustin Carstens in the Finternet paper stated a key difference with CBDC is the central bank will have absolute control. And Bo Lee said this will allow the smart contracts will allow targeted policy functions. So they're very open about talking about behaviour here.
Hmm.
And so you've got this combination of the composability, which is the bundled smart contracts together, and then the smart contracts, which themselves are the programmable money element of it. And the smart contracts are the government in New Zealand says there won't be any programmable money, but there'll be programmable functions. So that's really sleight of hand, because all of the banks, for example, the German bank working on this is saying, there'll be revocation clauses. Of course, in case they make a mistake, you don't want to put $500,000 in someone's bank account when you could put 50,000 in. They've got to be able to revoke, but there will be programmability from the start. Will have to be built into it, and this is the problem. Most of this is going to be black boxed and housed in the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, which is very separate from the rest of government functionality. So I'm probably jumping around a little bit
Oh,
too
it's good.
much. And
It's good. It is a spider
yeah,
web. Like it is. It's totally a spider web. Like when you're trying to understand it, it's not a linear progression. And I think it's good that you're jumping around here. And you mentioned Augustine Carstens a couple of times. So if the listeners or viewers need a visual representation of this person, just think Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars, and you're getting close, right? So what he said is so he's the general manager, I think, with Bank of International Settlements. BIS effectively is the central bank to central banks. With CBDCs, central banks will have the absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability, referring to CBDCs. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that. So it's that last bit, I think, that
well, it's
probably,
also that when he says central bank liability, because by saying that, he's intimating that they actually own all the money on that would be on these ledgers, which could be unified.
yeah. So what are we talking about here? We're kind of talking about a one world currency in a sense, where the system that has to be in place before that's in place. Would that be fair to say?
Well, he's definitely foreseeing that, because he talks about a unified ledger. So the unified ledger, if I just because I need to be very accurate, because we might have critical people listening, they're digital platforms that bring together multiple financial asset markets as executable, programmable objects. So you've got you can have the wholesale tokenized central bank money. So you can have wholesale, and then you can have the central bank money at the retail level, which would be us. It would be the tokenized commercial bank deposits and tokenized assets. It could be company shares. It could be corporate or government bonds and real estate. So he sees all these things getting loaded on what's called this unified ledger. And so the unified ledger is what where all the central banks kind of interlock, and the sort of the interlocking mechanisms, if you could call it that, are the APIs. They act like a translation device, allowing different software programs to communicate with each other. So that, again, they can be controlled as a one-tier system, entirely controlled by a central bank, or a two-tier system where services are provided by the private sector. So they connect all the different ledgers. And so they also connect, this layer also connects private and public infrastructures and intra-governmental infrastructures. So they pass instructions from the service providers to the central bank ledger. Now, it's really important to know that the APIs and the instructions that come in as the smart contracts, they can be manifold. They can come from manifold different places. So essentially what you can end up with just this an extraordinary amount of instructions that can impact your capacity to access your money and impact where you use it and how you use it, because we're going to have all these, so-called trusted, third parties that will be involved. And it's very clear, because the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, worked with the Bank of England. It was called Project Rosalind, and they confirmed that three-party locks can be programmed, whereby a trusted third party could specify functionality. So we know they're not envisaging it's just going to be one-on-one. It might happen. We might, like a referendum, it might happen once every now and then, but it's not really important. And they're seeing it as vastly important.
Right. And like, to give them credit, this isn't something that is a simple technology to just roll out. Like, this is something that requires insane amounts of coordination and cooperation, because what we're really talking about is kind of like the tokenization of all value and the centralization of where all that information feeds through to. So, like,
And the centralisation of control of that, of how that works, and the capacity to stop it and limit what is being undertaken by, for example, the Bank of International Settlement. So it's, we don't know what else is going on, who else, because often you have these out of sight sort of power struggles, and so you don't know who may be involved. So we can speculate on that. It's important to pull people back and say, this is not a done deal. So I really want people that are listening to understand that, as you said, this is the second of 3 consultations. There has never been an investigative journalist in staff or the New Zealand Herald or any of our public sort of legacy media outlets actually diving into the implications, for example, of the connection between digital IDs and CBDCs, but also the existing powers that the RBNZ has, and whether this new kind of potential to become a printer of programmable money will interact with their existing responsibilities and roles. So we haven't had the media talking about this. We haven't had meaningful parliamentary discussions that have been published on Hansard.
yeah.
So that, as far as I'm concerned, the members of parliament in New Zealand have absolutely no nuanced understanding of the issues at stake. There's letters of expectations that talk about what, the RBNZ, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, is going to do. And they didn't really show that the Minister of Finance was being briefed to the extent of what the RBNZ's doing. Then we also have the 20 to 25 funding proposal by the RBNZ, and the only thing it said in there was we need to build our policy capability and capacity to support the changes arising from the Future of Cash program and keep ahead of the developments in the fintech sector. So it feels like they're on this they see themselves as being on a technology base with that whole rubric around, we don't want to be left behind, but actually the role of anyone in government in New Zealand is to look at the long-term public interest, not to just not be so terrified of being left behind that they're happy to put us in over the longer term a digital gulag.
Wow. Okay. There's some meaty little threads that we can go down there. Digital IDs. So I don't really understand it like a massive amount, but I can kind of understand where things are probably going in the future, where in a new economy of Web3, the internet of value, you can't have all this value kind of floating around in the internet without clearly a connection to an individual. Otherwise, how do you prove ownership? So I can kind of understand it at a very rudimentary level like that. So when we're talking about programmable money, which is, I guess, a better word for it than digital cash, when we're talking about programmable money by a centralized authority like the RBNZ, we're talking about something that can have rules around expiry, where it can be sent, what the value is. So we might have 20 units, but that 20 units might be able to buy more of a certain type of good. Where it becomes really interesting, though, is that it's true for a certain type of person. And that's where the connection between not just the money in and of itself, but the money as it relates to the holder of the money is absolutely critical. Because to really get the precision, I suspect, that the RBNZ would like in terms of their monetary influence, you'd have to connect it to a person. And how do you connect something digital to an analog human, biological, right? You have to have a digital ID. So I know that there was some new legislation last year. I'm just trying to find it here. The Digital Identity Services Trust Framework Act 2023. How relevant is that piece of legislation, or how important is that as a prerequisite to ensure that CBDCs function well?
Yeah, it's central to it. So that couldn't be enacted before this. That had to be enacted first.
Interesting.
And PSGR was did send in an application, in a submission to that consultation. We were very concerned about it. What we see over and over again is inverted commas stakeholder consultations, where they basically set out the narrative, the pathway that they want to head down, and they'll say, "Oh, we consulted with Maori, we consulted with some community groups," but really, when you look at, I guess, the greater information that is out there, so people are walking often into these consultations blind and being asked for their opinion. And remember, there are probably 2 papers in the published scientific literature on CBDCs and with relevance to New Zealand. So we haven't seen any of the policy wonks writing big critical articles. So these stakeholder consultations are very formulaic. So the government says that we've consulted, and then they create this legislation. Then if you talk, and we see this again and again, if you talk outside the absolute text of the legislation, so if I talk about the long-term risk of digital IDs being linked to CBDCs, I would be outside the scope of that legislation, and they would dismiss my comments as irrelevant. So we see a lot of concerns arising, and we'll see that often. That'll be indicative from the amount of people that might respond to a consultation. But then when the select committee publishes their findings, you'll see them sort of dismissing a lot of people, either because they've all come in following, say, one group saying you need to respond to this consultation, and they say, "Oh, no, they're just political activists, we don't want them." But in reality, that community group might have given them the language that they didn't have before, because the language isn't in the New Zealand Herald or Staff or locally being talked about, or in TVNZ won't discuss it. So as a sociologist, I guess when I was studying my master's, I was absolutely fascinated by the role of ignorance and non-knowledge. It can achieve just as much when you don't know something as when you do. So it's a really hard thing. But if you were to read PSGR's submission paper on this and then go and look at the final legislation and the select committee, you'd sort of start understanding that people are being broadly dismissed and they're pushing the legislation through anyway.
So far in this conversation, what you're basically saying is that maybe central bank issued digital currencies, as they're being unfolded around the world, it's like a predetermined outcome that they're trying to achieve. It's not the natural progression of money. It's not evolution of money. It's really the evolution of the state, or a form of the state that maybe we haven't seen so overtly before, like the man coming out from behind the green curtain. So we're kind of seeing this now, or some of us are seeing it. But what you're saying is that only those that are within the system probably have the credibility and the authority to challenge it, but they can't, because good luck trying to convince someone of the truth that's running contrary to the revenue model, right? Am I summing up this so far correct?
Look, I think that's very, very accurate. And the Reserve Bank of New Zealand they have more powers than your average Reserve Bank. So that's the first issue.
Yeah.
But when it comes to to CBDCs, most of their information and advice is coming from the IMF, the BIS, and from Accenture and possibly other management consultancies. So I do have an Official Information Act request in right now to find out actually how much money the RBNZ have spent on management consultancies over the time of the CBDC campaign, which I call this a campaign. So Adrian Orr said this in the annual review. We are a full service bank. In Australia, we would be the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, plus a little of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, all put together, just to give you the scale and scope of what we do at Te Putea Matua. So let's call that RBNZ. We are uber connected globally and domestically. Our Council of Financial Regulators is a very meaningful group now, with very deliberate work together strategies, including the cooperation and coordination around our regulatory behaviours. The Trans-Tasman Banking Council, and we've talked about the sharing of information. And we work very closely together now and globally with the BIS, the IMF, and the South Pacific Group of Governors. And this has been an important network for us, and the executive members of the East Asia Pacific Group. So this is him acknowledging how much information is shared between the regulatory agencies and between the IMF and the BIS. So most people, again, aren't really aware of this, but as RBNZ Deputy Governor and General Manager Financial Stability, Christian Hawkesby, stated in 2022, he said, as an institution, we are going through the most significant changes since the Reserve Bank of New Zealand reforms of the 1980s. And these reforms were solely initiated following IMF Article 4 advice in 2017. Yes. So that led to the first phase in 2018, and now the second phase, which is all this stuff, which also includes the Financial Market Infrastructures Bill, which, if I can just drop this in, included the too big to fail legislation. Wow. We have this massive bank with massive powers that their feedback loop is regulatory environments and the BIS and the IMF. So that's very, very dangerous, because when this so this is a problem with technology. So we think of it, it'll just be in New Zealand and it'll just be the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. It's like, no, it's toggled to your identity. Then most of that identity regulation is presumed by one agency in New Zealand. Then the RBNZ is very closely aligned with the global central banks, which are very closely aligned. Their mentor is the BIS and Augustin Carstens. So this can be scaled up extraordinarily swiftly. And so that was when PSGR NZ sent our submission into this RBNZ consultation. That's what we said. It's, the scale and the nature and the potential of this is very dangerous, and there should be a moratorium on this, and we shouldn't be doing anything. Let's sit back. Let's watch the rest of the globe. You are not. So it's the left behind. We won't be technologically cool and we'll be left behind. It's like, I like them. Let's try to do everything we can to protect democracy, because the people and Parliament are being left behind while you actively engage with the BIS and IMF and get this cart horse, rushing at a crazy direction.
And like this is probably like a really good time, and I'll try my best to kind of pull out the other side of this now, just to see how you would react or respond to some of these, I guess, statements for CBDCs, because I think that it is true that there are some positive benefits from where I sit. Like I'm looking at things like, just if this kind of technology can make people's lives better, then I'm all for that. But it's not that simple. So here are some of the benefits that I was able to kind of pull out from the research that I've done so far. Enhanced monetary policy control. That would be the first one that I can think of. So right now, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has a lever they can pull to influence interest rates, to either create or destroy inflation. So if you could actually control that at a micro level, makes sense. It maintains the RBNZ's role as the currency provider. So if they have financial authority in New Zealand given to it by the state or by the people effectively, that's debatable. Then if we don't have a CBDC, then we're exposed to tech companies like Facebook's DM project or other types of cryptocurrency, and Apple Pay, for example, might have more influence than the RBNZ. It helps the digital transformation it helps the financial digital transformation. That's another one. It reduces settlement risks and it reduces costs. Those are just a few things that I could think of. And it just makes things a lot easier to transact with, because I'll be able to walk into a shopping center with my face being scanned, confirm my ID, and it just automatically takes the currency out of my digital wallet, takes the CBDCs out of my digital wallet. And hey, I didn't eat too much red meat this week, so I can, have a treat here and get some sausages, right? So what do you say to those positive benefits? Like, does anything kind of jump out and say, hey, that we don't need that?
Well, the monetary policy control is an interesting claim, but if you look at the fact that most monetary policy is produced through banks, through loans to banks making loans, sorry,
Sure.
and also through the budgetary and appropriations process. So I think it's really important that people understand that the difference between, taxpayer and other income to the government and government overall budget and their expenditure on infrastructure and stuff and all those other costs is called a deficit. And that deficit isn't debt, but that's actually just producing the necessary resourcing to be able to achieve the government aims.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that's part of the overall sort of monetary supply. Very important is that the banks should be reasonably autonomous, and also that the banks must be, I guess, responsible to primarily to the people that are lending them money. I guess let's step back before I go on to the other issues and talk about the fact that what is a democracy. And so we can think about democracy isn't voting once every 3 years. Democracy is really what the essence of democracy is self-governance and people having a role in the decisions of the government, and parliament being accountable to the people. When you get centralisation away from sort of your local bank to, for example, an Australian bank, to then the Bank of International Settlements, for example, if we shifted to, most of our income being on this ledger, if something goes wrong, what do we do? Because remember, you pointed out that it's our face that it looks at. So the digital ID, you must acquiesce to giving your an iris scan, your eye scan to get the digital ID. So your biometric data is part of you, but it's also part of this software, and it sort of entails ownership of you. And of course, we know that there's an increasing range of cameras that will be able to correlate where you are, when you are, who you are, based on this. And so that's surveillance. So the monetary policy control has very, very big downsides if it's becoming increasingly centralized.
Yeah.
And so, when you talk about RBN's role of the currency provider and their nervousness that we might be going to tech or to other crypto.
Yeah.
Tech and crypto is a whole different regulatory environment. And what we see with tech and crypto right now is we see it's being dominated by, like really, really bright men with time on their hands and resourcing on their hands to do this. I know some people that have done it, but I don't know any housewives or women or mums that that have really got deeply into crypto. Because what the role of governance and society is to actually look after families and kids. It's not to chase tech. So the role of the government through the appropriations process, for example, to budget for adequate health and budget for adequate education, and to ensure that you can safely borrow money, and to ensure that money won't be downgraded, relevant to the cost of butter, and you won't become increasingly debt ridden. It's the capacity for people to be, and this is the sociologist coming out, productive is dependent on us not being in such extraordinary debt that we can't eat healthy food and sleep in a healthy environment. So the government, fundamentally, their role above all these claims around currency providers and keeping up with tech is fundamentally to keep society safe and happy and healthy. And they really don't have a language for that anymore, because they appropriate the language of these management consultancies. So that's sort of answering a lot of that. Then you also talked about the settlement risks and the settlement costs. So this is, and we say this at the end of our big long paper, this is where central banks should be working. They should be working with big corporations, big industries, other banks, to make sure that at the retail level and at the wholesale level, international exchanges of money can happen in such a way that it ensures confidentiality, ensures local autonomy, and keeps, again, people and particularly small business, small, medium-sized business safe. Because the minute you get, again, that concentration of businesses, and it's only the big elephants, the big elite corporations, you actually stop being efficient, because people inside those corporations do exactly what they're told, no matter how stupid it is. And there's that international economist that's allied, that's been doing a lot of work. He looked at Japan and monetary policy with Japan, but
Oh,
he's
Richard
doing a lot
Werner?
of work now on, pardon?
Richard Werner?
Yeah, he's doing a lot of work on the importance of small local
Yeah.
banks, and how we need to actually become educated about the importance of small local banks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is that, have I wandered
No,
around too much?
no. That's good. And kind of what you're feeding back really here is this battle between centralization and decentralization that you can see playing out in almost every power structure, where there's seasons and cycles, some secular, some cyclical, where you just go through changes, right? Where shopping malls are a fad, and then it's the boutique shops, and then it goes the other way again. And I guess as it relates to the credit decisions that your bank currently makes to issue new credit creation to you is going to be based on their individual assessment and relationship with you as an individual, understanding your world. But as that begins to centralize now, so thinking New Zealanders to the RBNZ, because that's potentially where this goes, where you can just go onto your app and see how much you qualify that day because of your behavior. Sweet, that's how much I can borrow. But then it goes even further, where we have this more of an international flavor to this, right? And so I guess the other part of this, and this is kind of just going back to the inevitability of this all, like anything, if we believe something is wrong, even if it is inevitable, we should stand up, because that is democracy right there. And if good people stay quiet, then all sorts of evil abound. And so if we think about where this all goes, if New Zealand, for example, or Australia, or wherever country you're from, if you said no and you were successful in stopping it, then what happens if the rest of the world goes ahead? They quote unquote evolve, leaving us behind. And the New Zealanders don't like being left behind. That's what causes them to do a lot of stuff, because everybody else is doing it. Do you think that that will ultimately cause people to turn a blind eye, even willfully, at their own expense, because they don't want to be left behind while the rest of the world moves on here?
Well, the year before, our previous large white paper was on propaganda. And when the information that informs us is predominantly produced and controlled by the information, by the institutions with the conflict of interest, we've concluded that that should be reframed or communicated as propaganda. So what we're seeing is the bulk of information supporting CBDCs is produced in these forums: World Economic Forum, produced by the management consultancies, produced by people allied and affiliated with the management consultancies. And then we also see these big black holes where this information is not being produced. So I think people do have to wake up, but it's extraordinarily difficult, because I'm speaking to Darcy, and I spoke to Leighton, and I'll speak to Reality Check Radio, and these platforms will cover me, but I cannot get published on RNZ, and they simply won't go out of scope, out of what they're somehow permitted to say. And I always thought it was because, well, I wasn't enough of an expert. And I don't know, listening to me today, you can say she's just a sociologist, that she's just full of rubbish. But okay, so where is the expert that's actually not allied or affiliated with the powerful institutions with the conflicts of interest? And unfortunately, they're not out there. So one of the best ways to avoid that is to have a moratorium where you actually you hold that space.
Right.
And I turn back to the whole point of a government, if you want to call this a democracy, is to protect the public interest, to prevent the abuse of power, and to keep people safe and healthy, including future generations.
So yeah, on that abuse of power, just because you give somebody a loaded gun doesn't mean they're going to use it, right? So there's that argument. If, say, central banks had the ability to program our money, our value, and they said, it's okay, we're not going to do anything with it, do we have any reason why we shouldn't believe them? Like, why not just give them the benefit of the doubt that, hey, this is going to be great for us? And sure, they'll have the ability to turn off our purchasing power at any stage, but they would never do that. Are we kind of thinking about them as these evil entities when really they don't deserve it?
Well, as they said in their consultation, so we're not going to program the money, but we'll sort of have programmability functions. They're already engaged in doublespeak, and the people they turn to for the most important reforms since the 80s is the IMF. The people they're turning to for their advice here is Accenture, a multi-billion dollar management consultancy who has extraordinary ties with the fintech, the financial international finance corporation. So when you look at the culture of any regulatory agency, whether the culture is able to act in the public interest or they are not, you need to look at who they are most closely associated with. So the RBNZ has shown that it's demonstrated that it's more closely associated with Accenture and the BIS, and you can see that their consultations to date have sort of been proxy consultations because they really have not wanted to discuss people's concerns around relating to the programmable smart contracts. And in the Accenture dossier that was one of the documents supplied, Accenture were a lot more sort of willing to sort of talk about that, whereas the RBNZ documents basically pretended they didn't exist.
Interesting. I had a look at the submissions, and Accenture, this massive global consulting firm, started in the early 80s. Clearly, they have their fingerprint here everywhere, not just in New Zealand, but in other places as well. And like this is something that a professional consulting firm has gone out and done deals with central banks and governments to create a pathway for this to actually be implemented. Like that in and of itself is a massive newsworthy story. Again, I don't know why media doesn't cover that. It shouldn't take people that don't operate in this space like yourself and like even myself to some degree. It shouldn't be on us to talk about this. It should be on media. Like that's like do your job, right? But I want to change the angle a little bit here with you, Jodie, and just kind of introduce a completely different for some people, this might be quite shocking. I don't know. This is from another document, you could say, 2,000 years ago is where this one's coming from. Book of Revelation, 13, verse 16 and 17. He, referring to the false prophet, required everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given a mark on the right hand or on the forehead, and no one could buy or sell anything without that mark. Do you see any connection here between that text, that scripture from 2,000 years ago, and what you see happening today?
Well, I think we shouldn't. This is a really interesting point. I'm really grateful you've asked that question, and this is because it's the nature of power. We've all heard of that billionaire who, oh, it wasn't enough for him to have two super yachts; he had to have four. And when you look back at the history of the Rockefeller family and the history of aristocracy, when you look at how power works and how people really do, once you become disentangled from your neighbors and your fellow citizens, there are people around us, and you've got with often psychopathic personalities. They might be very linear people that have been just taught to win, and they will seek to win at all costs, and they will seek to win at scale. So we need to think the idea of tagging everyone like sheep and cattle is not the most crazy idea, because you often, these people that have no compassion for people, it's pretty normal when you think about them to think, well, we tag sheep and cattle, so why don't we tag people? When you look at what happened in totalitarian Germany, so the issue is when we get the state. So remember, years ago they separated church and state, and what we've seen is sort of the rise of large corporations. in that stead. And I guess what we're not seeing, and so this is the right wing were always charged with making sure that those big corporations would be broken down through the Commerce Act, through antitrust regulation. They would be broken down so they did not become too powerful. Because remember, the whole purpose of democracy is to protect people, to prevent the abuse of power, because monopoly is the most natural game in the world. So that's what these people will do. So I think we need to develop a language where at the dinner table with our mates we can actually talk about this. And there's a study of evil. It's called ponerology. There's a book I've got. I'm just looking, I can't remember, political ponerology. You can search it up. And so we need to understand, yes, there are actually really bad actors out there that seek simply to accrue power. So we should not be naive, and we should actually look at that was the whole purpose of the Constitution, is to give us the principles and the values that help us make decisions. So right now the RBNZ is being technical. They're following all these technical opportunities. And the way they then say, we need this for monetary policy, we need this to keep control of the monetary system, is disingenuous, because they're ignoring all the other digital money in the system, and they're failing to disclose the extent to which the BIS, that is their main mentor, understands about the programmability and the potential, the composability, which means they can group people together to control them.
Yeah. Like you mentioned, around the dinner table, people should have the language and should have the freedom and the confidence to be able to have these conversations. Is it a case that because it's just too technical, people are unwilling to go there? Or is it because they just haven't heard enough people that they somewhat respect actually talk about this sort of thing?
Yeah, so turning to the information in our ecosphere. So if you look at what you've read, what you've seen, what comes up on Amazon, the streaming services, Amazon, none of the streaming services are looking at this critically. And so this becomes something that is, I know about it and I infer that it's safe and effective. They're inferring that it's safe and effective because I haven't seen anything negative about it. But unlike someone like me that goes and looks at this production of science and how difficult it is for scientists and researchers to get funding to look at social harms from our technologies, they infer because they hadn't heard anything bad. So it's very easy, particularly for people with that black and white brain that is very linear and technical, to assert, no, that's silly. You're just being stupid. Don't be dumb like that. But it's sort of like, if I think about, okay, so when we were raising babies 10,000 years ago, we had to create stories around a waterhole. So in New Zealand, we have tanifas. In Australia, we have bunyips that make that waterhole sometimes really scary and dangerous to go near. And that sometimes the bunyip or the tanifa is in a happy mood and we can go near there. So that then protected the children. And that was a story that wasn't necessarily what these black and white people would call correct, but it saved their health of their children. So then if the average person sits down at the dinner table and tries to talk about this, and this, you can hear me talking today, I sort of know a little bit about this, but at a dinner party with my own friends, I have to be very limited in what I talk about, because I'm contradicting all the belief. It's sort of not like the beliefs, but they're knowledges that become heuristics, that become their automatic, like the reflection, their reflex
Their operating
response.
system.
Yeah, their operating system, because the operating systems are receiving back on an environment that doesn't actually show that this is harm. So they've heard many, many times that we need to keep up with our technology, and that we need to protect, the Reserve Bank needs to protect monetary sovereignty. They didn't listen to all the other things because of course RNZ and so on will only actually really interview the Reserve Bank of New Zealand to find out about what's happening. And then they might ask a politician, well, what do you reckon? But the politician themselves have not been briefed on anything outside what Accenture or the RBNZ is saying.
Yeah.
So they're captured. It's capture. And, you've got the airline, and the plane crashes, and then there is the black box, and the black box contains all this really important information. But what we have through the smart contracts, the APIs, the ledger technology, and the capacity for toggling of lots of different people or lots of different smart contracts is the potential black boxing of at extraordinary power and scale
Sure.
that
Okay.
potentially can never be understood by a democratic parliament and by citizens in New Zealand.
Okay.
So we can talk about black boxing at a dinner table, and people go, "Oh yeah, I kind
Right,
of."
yeah. All I'm thinking about is I'm just as you've been talking, I've just been thinking about all the cameras that are watching me as I drive in the bus lane. Of course, I'm not driving in the bus lane, but if I was, and I can't access that information and view it, but I think a lot of people just assume that if somebody is filming you in a public place, especially if they're somewhat associated with a government of some type, you should be able to access the information on yourself and view it. Not the case. I think also that there is a lot of other information that we kind of just assume is okay. Like, hey, or about this? I've got some cash and I go into a shop to buy something with my cash, my physical cash, and they say, no, we don't accept that. I think a large portion of society would go, well, what does this mean when it says legal tender? Don't you have to accept that? Well, that's not the case anymore either. So you merge those two things together, right? And that is a picture of, hey, a lot has changed since maybe you last looked. And this is maybe just the beginning. Again, bring it back to the start. If we're building wealth for the new world and we're trying to understand what that new world looks like, we have to consider the form that the wealth takes when it gets back into our possession. So we might invest in something, we liquidate that investment. Where does it go? If it goes into CBDCs, and we've been mildly outspoken on a topic on a podcast that you shouldn't have come on, Jodie, and now you're punished. You can't spend that resource. Is that the world that
Yeah.
we're heading into, do you think?
Well, you've made me think of a couple of things. The first one is, so there's a sociology study I love. I think it's a social science study, and they looked at councillors, politicians, how they acted when journalists were there versus how they acted when journalists were not there. So when there's transparency and accountability, there's better governance. So most of this is not going to be transparent and accountable. So over time, again, there's a potential for harms at scale. Then we look at the example of, for example, the Canadian truckers. So many of those during COVID, many of those truckers had been already going between America and Canada, and they were fully vaccinated, all that sort of thing. But after a while, people started realizing that this was unjust and unfair, and the governments were not being fully accountable here and transparent. And so they started, the Canadian truckers started, they all came together, and there was this big protest that got bigger and bigger and bigger. And what happened was the government of Canada asked the banks to freeze their money. And the government of Canada didn't only just freeze the bank accounts, so people, I think, were possibly paying through PayPal or something like that lots of donations were coming in because a lot of people lost their income, was sacked. Most of the money, and let's be very clear here, was very small amounts of money from people that weren't wealthy. So all this money was coming through PayPal, and then they froze that and took the money from PayPal. So we know right now, the government, if you're going to protest, arbitrary, unconscionable conduct by your government, and you're doing it in such a way that you get big and they don't like it, you can actually have your bank accounts frozen. But right now, that's a pretty clunky, clumsy process. So what the government might have done is they might have looked at the registration of the vehicles and then tied that back to the owner and then found that bank account and then froze it. If you have cameras, surveillance cameras that can see your biometric ID, and a group of you are in one place, what could quickly happen then is they'll say, great, we've got X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E people. This is who they are. That biometric data is linked to the digital ID, which is linked to bank accounts, and then they can quickly push the smart contract through. So they could have the capacity in 4 days to quell any disturbance or anything that contradicted their priorities. This is certainly not democracy. This the capacity of this technology. And so again, if you look at authoritarianism or what totalitarian governments are, an association, a union between big corporations and the state, and there is no capacity for people to say this is wrong. We need to challenge you here. There's absolutely no capacity for that, and so it looks to me that the rails that we're being guided along are taking us to that space, because the third-party providers will be often contracted corporations. And we also could see our big banks sort of saying, oh, well, I'm not going to, scream at the government, but maybe I could be one of the providers and I could operate on this tier framework. And so they essentially become, I guess, the brown shirts for the government. And they do that because otherwise the government might put in more regulations that make it harder for them. So we see all these sort of strategies that can be quite underhand if you don't actually have a media, the fourth estate, and if academia have been silenced.
All right, man, what a conversation. Now, just to finish up on this, your view is that there should be a moratorium. So that means, hey, let's just pause, take a chill pill, and just take a break for a while so that people can kind of just catch up to what's going on. That would be the base case. That would be what you were pushing here. But what else would you like to see happen here, if not just that? Because that's pretty big right there.
Yeah, so we've set a moratorium until 2030 where nothing is done, where we're not conducting little proxy like trials or anything like that, where we sit back and where we do that. I would like to see funding for academic research that is at arm's length from these big agencies that have so much power. We also talked about, the Department of Internal Affairs. We need a major inquiry regarding the extent of the Department of Internal Affairs' power. I think this is rather extraordinary. And we did actually say that what we're seeing increasingly is government agencies requiring you to have a digital ID in order to access government services, for example, firearms, or if you want a review of a dispute through the Ministry for Business and Innovation and Employment, you have to have a digital ID. I looked at funding through the lottery scheme for PSGR, and you're required to have a digital ID. I actually believe there should be legislation in place that says a passport, a driver's license, or digital ID are equally acceptable, because what we're seeing is we're seeing mission creep on digital IDs that are forcing people. So we could easily say government, you can only get a job as a government employee if you have a digital ID, and perhaps that's already in some agencies now. So I think it's looking at the technical rules around digital IDs are quite important, and just this moratorium on CBDCs because of the extent to which they've been influenced by corporations. So if I just, the four things, just to simplify it down towards the end of our conversation, is, PSGR, we had four big concerns. One was the digital IDs were coupled to CBDCs enhance all of government oversight over private activity. The second one is the fact that they're being transferred electronically through these smart contracts, which can be composable, and there can be lots of them through this API layer. The third one is the reduction in potential for parliamentary oversight. This is huge. We already can see there is already extraordinary evidence of Parliament has no concept of the extent and depth of the powers that this would give the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. And also it will conflict. So the RBNZ are meant to be supervising money, for example, in the banking sphere already. If the RBNZ go and start printing their own money, they're going to be competing with commercial banks. This is very anti-competitive. So, and then the fourth thing is that the continued increase in oversight and delegation of the production of strategy, policy, and rules to the Bank of International Settlements and the International Monetary Fund is basically pushing oversight and rulemaking and guideline making, and it's turning them into the boss, because the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, they're the primary sort of mentors, they're the primary information route for the RBNZ. So they're pivoting further RBNZ away from public interest stuff to their interests. So that's sort of the four themes, I guess, and we've talked about that today, but just to help people
Thank you.
kind of get a handle on it.
No, thank you. Thank you. And like I read maybe about, I don't know, 40 to 50% of it, because it is a long document, but I could see that there was a lot of solid research in there. So I will be putting a link in the show notes to that. All we can do is become aware of what it is. I would still say, hey, look at both sides, the merits or the shortfalls. It'll stand on its own. You don't need to kind of force any good lens or bad lens over this. It is what it is. You'll see it. But do your research. Be bold enough to talk about it. You're not completely a nutter, or at least you're in good company with a whole bunch of other nutters, right? And they just don't realize it yet. So.
No, we have to be curious. We have survived, for millennia by being curious about, the latest plant that we found in the field when we were hunters and gatherers, to how do those two, metals bind together. Politics is about being curious, and going back to Sun Tzu and the art of war, it's all about information. It's all about ignorance. And so I think it's really great that you're interviewing to me. And I urge people not just to listen to this podcast with us, but to actually share it across social media, because if you listen to it, the information stops with you. But that's my problem. I don't have a social media budget. I don't have money for boosting. So, someone like you, Darcy, is really important, because you're enabling me to talk about this. So thank you. I'm really grateful.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for having a conversation with me. Likewise. That's awesome. Well, thank you, Jodie. And if people want to reach out to you, where's the best place for them to go to kind of follow some of the latest research that you're putting out there?
So I'm on Twitter, Jodie Bruning, JodieBruning, at Twitter. But I cover a lot of stuff. So if people are exclusively interested in this, they just need to know I'm broad. Yeah. I'm on Substack as JRBRUNING. And so Talking Risk, you'll find me at Talking Risk. And Physicians and Scientists for Global Responsibility is at PSGRNZ. So I'm their lead researcher of most of my works with them. And again, they're the same. It's, we don't have very many members. We're we need members. So if anyone thinks that we're great, please join us. Cool. And, we're very under-resourced, because we're not a stakeholder, Darcy. We don't get in on all these conversations, even though we've been around for 25 years. It's unbelievable.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Thank you again, Jodie. Catch you next one.
Thank you.